So today we continue in the second of our sermon series in the book of Daniel. The series is entitled, God is Sovereign over Everyone and Everything. And we started this series last week. I think we probably heard something about the history and the background to this chapter. We're going to read chapter 2 of Daniel today. But at the time of Daniel, the Jewish nation was divided into the tribes of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And we read how the powerful king, Nebuchadnezzar II, had captured Jerusalem in the year 605 BC. Daniel and his companions were taken into exile and chosen to be trained for 3 years to become part of the king's group of royal advisors. They were willing to learn the language, the literature, and the practices of the Babylonians, but all the while remaining true to the God of Israel. We read that they performed at the top of their class, and despite living in a pagan society, they held fast to their faith. This week, we read how Daniel's faith is put to the test when the mighty king has a troubling, recurring dream. When none of his wise men are able to recount and interpret the dream, he decrees they should all be killed, including Daniel and his friends, because they were also wise men in training. So this is a crisis situation for Daniel and his companions. Their lives are in real danger here. But as we go on to read, God is in control over everyone and everything. God has set up the situation for his purposes. To demonstrate his power is greater than that of any earthly ruler, so that Nebuchadnezzar and the people of Babylon might recognize him as being the one true God. So let's read our passage for today in Daniel chapter 2, and I'm going to read verses 1 to 30 to start off with. It's a long chapter, so I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to start off with verses 1 to 30. So we read in the book of Daniel, in the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His mind was troubled, and he could not sleep. So the king summoned the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it." The king replied to the astrologers, "This is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I will have you cut into pieces and your houses turned into piles of rubble. But if you tell me the dream and explain it, you will receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." Once more they replied, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it." Then the king answered, "I am certain that you are trying to gain time, because you realize that this is what I have firmly decided. If you do not tell me the dream, there is just one penalty for you. You have conspired to tell me misleading and wicked things, hoping the situation will change. So then, tell me the dream, and I will know that you can interpret it for me." The astrologers answered the king, "There is not a man on earth who can do what the king asks. No king, however great and mighty, has ever asked such a thing from any magician or enchanter or astrologer. What the king asks is too difficult. No one can reveal it to the king except the gods, and they do not live among men. This made the king so angry and furious that he ordered the execution of all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, had gone out to put to death the wise men of Babylon, Daniel spoke to him with wisdom and tact. He asked the king's officer, "Why did the king issue such a harsh decree?" Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel. At this, Daniel went in to see the king and asked for time so that he might interpret the dream for him. Then Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He urged them to plead for mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not be executed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. During the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. Then Daniel praised the God of heaven and said, "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, O God of my fathers, for you have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king." Then Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to execute the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, "Do not execute the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king, and I will interpret his dream for him." Arioch took Daniel to the king at once and said, "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can tell the king what his dream means." The king asked Daniel, also called Belteshazzar, "Are you able to tell me what I saw in my dream and interpret it?" Daniel replied, "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. He has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in days to come. Your dream and the visions that pass through your mind as you lay on your bed are these. As you were lying there, O king, your mind turned to things to come, and the revealer of mysteries showed you what is going to happen. As for me, this mystery has been revealed to me, not because I have greater wisdom than other living men, but so that you, O king, may know the interpretation, and that you may understand what went through your mind." So we'll leave it there, as Daniel has been given the revelation from God, and he's about to reveal it to the king. And we'll come back to that later. So then, as we read there in the chapter 2 of Daniel, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, so this is about the year 602 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream. His spirit was so troubled that he couldn't sleep. And we think this took place during the time that Daniel was on his 3-year training course, or possibly soon after he'd finished. I say that because you note that when the king called in all the wise men, he didn't call Daniel and his group into that meeting, so Daniel wasn't there at the first instance. And we read that there was something very disturbing about this dream. The king knew that this was unusually significant. And so he demands from his wise men to know what the dream is and its interpretation. He summons the magicians, the enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers to tell him what he had dreamed. He says to them, "I have had a dream that troubles me, and I want to know what it means. Tell us the dream and we will interpret it," they say to the king. But the king refuses to do this because God is shaping all of this. God is behind this. And so the king's request is unusual. It's something that seems impossible in human terms. Both tell him what the dream was and then interpret its meaning. It's like telling somebody, "I've got a maths problem in my head. Tell me what the problem is and then solve it." So it's humanly impossible. Nebuchadnezzar is asking for proof that these people have supernatural abilities. And he also gives them some fairly powerful motivation, both negative and positive, to solve the mystery. He says to them, "If you can't do this, I'm going to have you executed and destroy your houses. But if you tell me the dream, I'm going to reward you handsomely and bring great honor to you. So tell me the dream and interpret it for me." And once more these wise men say, "Let the king tell us the dream and we will interpret it." But the king stands firm on his decree. I guess we can't be certain whether Nebuchadnezzar actually remembered the details of his dream or not. Perhaps he had a general sense of some of the details, but only sketchily. And he didn't know for certain whether these wise men would give him the correct interpretation or not of his dream. But he could test their ability to tell him what he had dreamed. You see, this group of people, these sorcerers and wise men and astrologers, had claimed to have spiritual information through supernatural sources. But in the end, they say to him that these sources of information aren't accessible, even though they've been telling the king for years that they could do this, that they had contact with the spirits, with the gods in heaven. But yet, when it comes to the crunch, they say, "It's impossible, we can't do this." They say to the king, "Your request is too difficult. There is no one on earth who can do what the king asks. No king has ever asked of anything so difficult before. No one can do this except the gods, and they don't live among human beings." So they're right in one sense that they're admitting that revelation comes from God to man. And they understood that this was not something that could be achieved by men without God's help. They had no answer for Nebuchadnezzar because only God could bring an answer to the king. And what's his reaction? He's angry and furious, and he orders that they all get executed. So he issues a decree and says, "Put all the wise men to death." And that includes Daniel and his friends, because they were wise men in training. They were part of this group. Nebuchadnezzar knew that false religion was of no use. He had no use for these wise men if they couldn't bring him wisdom from God. And it's almost like at this point, Nebuchadnezzar has become an atheist because he doesn't believe anymore in these false gods and all the people connected with them. What is God doing here? God's purpose is to use his servant, Daniel, to reveal who has the truth. God can go where men cannot, and he goes directly into the head of the most powerful man in the world and plants this dream into his head. When those astrologers and sorcerers admitted that they were liars, Nebuchadnezzar gets angry. So God is revealing the lies, and he's revealing who the deceivers are. And God is preparing one of his own followers to speak the truth. Do we see parallels in the modern world in which we live? We live in a society where people are looking for answers to many troubling issues. And God wants to use his people to reveal himself to a disturbed world. This story shows us the emptiness of answers that don't include God in the equation. Daniel knew that all those wise men were fakes, that their wisdom was man-made. The gods that they believed in were not real and couldn't help them. Unlike Daniel, these wise men do not pray because there's no one there to answer them. This is a test of faith, and it is to God whom Daniel turns to at this time of danger. And in our lives too, we encounter challenges which test our faith. We have a God in whom we can trust, who we can turn to for answers in our most pressing times of need. Daniel needs a miracle, or rather a series of miracles, to save his life and to save the lives of his companions. And Daniel reacts to Nebuchadnezzar's decree by asking for a brief extension of time. This wasn't just stalling. Daniel knew that it takes time to listen to God and to wait on him. And Daniel was willing to take that time if the king would grant it. And so the first miracle is accomplished when he gets to see the king and his request for time is granted. God could have just given the answer directly to Nebuchadnezzar, but instead he chooses to use one of his own people who he had put into that situation to reveal the truth to the king. Daniel asks his companions to join him in urgent prayer. Verse 17. Daniel returned to his house and explained the matter to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We usually know them better by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He urged them to plead for mercy from God concerning this mystery, so that he and his friends might not get executed. Daniel and his friends prayed urgently because they knew that God was accessible and would respond to their faith. Daniel was in a kind of situation where only God could meet his need. Have you ever been in that kind of situation? And therefore he knew how important it was to pray. This is the crucial turning point in this story, when Daniel and his friends pray to God. Daniel had confidence that God could do an unprecedented miracle. In the past, in the Old Testament, we read how Joseph had interpreted dreams with God's help, but he hadn't reconstructed a dream that he hadn't heard. So considering what was at stake here, their lives, there's little doubt that these prayers were extremely urgent, extremely earnest. God listens to earnest prayer. We have other examples of people praying or calling out in faith in the Old Testament. In Genesis chapter 18, Abraham pleads with God to spare Lot and his family. In Numbers 14, we read about Moses interceding for Israel, for the people of Israel. And then, very famously, in 1 Kings 18, Elijah asking God to send fire on Mount Carmel, and how God responds in such a miraculous way. And we read in verse 19 that God reveals Nebuchadnezzar's dream and its interpretation to Daniel. Daniel didn't find it out for himself. God revealed it to him. We read in verse 19, during the night, the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And Daniel praises God for this revelation. He says, verse 20, the prayer of Daniel, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises up others. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for you have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. So Daniel praises God for his power and might. He sees the following: how God is in command of all things, and how God is mightier than a mighty king like Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel thanks God for speaking to man. All God's power and might wouldn't have been any help to him if God had stayed silent. But God is gracious, and he reveals this knowledge to Daniel. And then we see that Daniel had certainty of faith to believe that God had given him the answer, even before he goes to confirm it to Nebuchadnezzar. So that might be a question that we might ask ourselves in our lives in a practical way. How do we know when God has answered our prayers? How do we know that we are certain? How can we be certain that we are following God's will? Well, that might be something that we take up in our home groups or in our study later on this week, about how we know that we are following God's will and how he answers us. Sometimes God gives us a peace so that we know, or a sign of confirmation, so that we know what his will is, but we know that God answers our prayers. So then let's read the rest of this passage. So let's read verses 44 to 49 now. And I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I'm not going to go into any detail about the dream itself. You can study it for yourself later if you want to know the details. It involves a fairly complicated series of pictures about statues which are destroyed and then replaced. But the essence of it is this, that God is revealing to Nebuchadnezzar that he, God, will eventually usher in a heavenly kingdom that will last forever and never be replaced. And through this dream, God is giving Nebuchadnezzar a vision of the future of the end times, a vision of God's power and glory. So let's see how Nebuchadnezzar reacts to God's message to him. Let's read, if we can get it on the screen. No, you can't get it on the screen, that's fine. I'll read it out. I have a copy here. Verses 44 to 49, the concluding part of this chapter. So this is Daniel explaining the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And as I say, it's a vision of the future, and God is telling Nebuchadnezzar that he's going to start, that in the future there will be a heavenly kingdom that will last forever, that God will inaugurate. So in verse 44, it says this in the chapter. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to any other people. It will crush the kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will in itself endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision. The rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, the gold to pieces. These are the details of Nebuchadnezzar's vision. I'm not going to go into all the details. It's fairly complicated. But God is saying, I am going to usher in a heavenly kingdom that will last forever. And Daniel says to the king, the great God has shown the king what will take place in the future. The dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Then what happens? King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor, and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery. Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all the wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the court. So Daniel goes before the king and explains the dream to him. Daniel knows what has happened is God's doing, and is determined that Nebuchadnezzar will know this too. He doesn't try to glorify himself, even though Nebuchadnezzar, as we read, is extremely grateful and rewards him generously. What's important is that Nebuchadnezzar knows that there is a God in heaven who speaks the truth and is interested in a relationship with us. So in this story, God is not just saving Daniel's life, God is speaking to Nebuchadnezzar and wants Nebuchadnezzar to know him as well, to listen to him and to believe in him. And in our time too, God wants to use people who will stand to the side and point to him. Daniel refuses to take credit, recognizing that the credit goes to God, who revealed this dream to him. Can we see how God is working throughout this story? God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to identify these people of the truth, people whose God is real. And that's the lesson for us here. God uses people like us to talk to other people, to point them to God, and to reveal his truth. And the question we need to ask is, can God use me? As Christians, we are in this process of transformation so that we can be salt and light in this world and point people to God. So to conclude, let's summarize a couple of things that we have learned in this chapter. Daniel is a man of faith who knows God can help him in a desperate situation. Nebuchadnezzar was a powerful king and a practical man. He had already begun to suspect the truth that these wise men were giving him. He had no use for useless religion. He had no use for useless philosophy. He wants to hear revelation inspired by God. We live in a society where many people don't believe in God. They are either atheists, that is, they don't believe that God exists, or else they fall into a kind of practical agnosticism. They live reasonably affluent and comfortable lives and don't see any practical need for God. The modern consumer society meets practically all their needs, or is meant to. They don't see any use for God, that is, until they're in desperate trouble. They don't need God, that is, until they have deeply troubling personal issues. Issues that humanistic philosophy doesn't have the answers for. We have a God who is real, who answers prayers and offers us comfort in the many testing situations that we find ourselves in. We believe in a God who can do miracles. We believe in a God who can resolve situations that are humanly impossible. That's been my experience. There have been times in my life when I've been in desperate trouble and I needed God to help me. I needed a miracle and I had no one else to turn to. And I have seen God perform miracles and rescue me from impossible situations. And I know that's true for many of you too. Every week we have good news stories where we share times when God has helped us or blessed us in matters small and large. Just as an example, I remember Elon sharing with us a few weeks ago when you had an urgent issue that needed resolution. I think it was a financial issue, a financial problem, and you committed it to God in prayer, and almost immediately he resolved the problem for you. And hearing that is a great encouragement for all of us when we go through similar times. And I know that you believe as a congregation, because last week I saw many people come forward for prayer after the service, asking for God's help and his blessing in matters of health or spiritual need. Sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers immediately, and sometimes not in the way that we're expecting. Sometimes it takes years of prayer before God provides a breakthrough. But we know that he is a God in whom we can have confidence in, who wants to bless us, who has a perfect plan for each of our lives. And he reveals those plans to us if we trust in him, if we depend on him, if we seek him in earnest prayer. And so to finish, there are two messages that I want us to take from this passage this morning. The first is that we serve a God in whom we can trust. As Sheila reminded me this morning in a prayer, we serve the same God that Daniel served, and he can help us in the same way. We can turn to him when we are in need. He is a God of power and miracles who is there to help us in times of trouble. That's the first message that I wanted to summarize. And then the second message is that God wants to involve each one of us in revealing the truth to others. God puts us in different situations to point others to him. So then, to finish, may God bless each one of us this morning and help us to live by faith and allow him to use us to be part of that mission that he entrusts to us.